Humanity left without a word, and the Galactic Council finally understood their error. The cup was still warm. That is the detail I could not stop thinking about. Ambassador Elaine Norwood had left her cup of Synthicaf sitting on the docking port beside Terminal 7G. The session log showed she had been present at the morning recess. Her personal access key had logged out at 9:14 Standard Time. The afternoon session began at 11 o'clock. Her seat was empty. And the cup was still warm. I am Kaelvorin, Senior Archivist to the Galactic Council. I have served in this building for 41 years. I have watched empires argue over water rights on moons no one had ever visited. I have transcribed peace agreements that lasted 3 years and trade deals that outlasted civilizations. I have seen delegates cry, threaten, walk out, and return the next morning with fresh suits and old grudges. In 41 years, I had seen everything. I had never seen a species simply stop showing up. Let me be precise, because precision is my profession. On the 14th day of the third cycle of the year 4441 by the Council Standard Calendar, the human delegation to the Galactic Council ceased all contact. No letter of withdrawal. No diplomatic recall from their home government. No ultimatum. No announcement. No press statement. Ambassador Elaine Norwood logged out of her terminal at 9:14 in the morning, and the human species disappeared from galactic politics as cleanly as a light being switched off. I discovered the absence before anyone else did, because I am the one who prepares the session rolls. When I reached seat 7G on my attendance sheet and found the name without a check mark, I waited. I checked again at the start of the afternoon session. I sent a routine notification to the human delegation's registered communications address. The message was received. No reply came. I sent a second notification the next morning. Again, received. No reply. On the third day, I walked down to the delegation housing block myself. The human suite was neat and locked. When I requested a maintenance override, I found it empty. The furniture was still there. The terminal was still there. Everything was exactly as it had been issued, cleaned, and organized with that particular human precision that I had come to recognize over the years. They had not taken anything extra. They had not left anything behind. It was as if the suite had been prepared for a new occupant. I filed an internal report and waited for someone above me to act on it. No one did, because the people above me did not yet understand what they were looking at. Grand Arbiter Thesavon of the Dalarak hegemony, who held the chair of the council that cycle, received my report and held a brief sidebar with his senior staff. His response, which I recorded in the official minutes because it was spoken aloud in a formal corridor of the conclave spire and therefore fell under my jurisdiction, was this: humans are impulsive. They threw a tantrum before. They always come back. He was speaking of an incident 14 years prior, when the human delegation had staged a 3-day walkout over a procedural vote. They had returned on the 4th day and said nothing more about it. Thesavon believed this was the same thing, only larger. I was not certain he was wrong. But I was not certain he was right, either. I want to tell you something about the human delegation, something the official record does not capture well. I want to tell you what it was actually like to sit near them, to watch them work, to process their filings and motions over 11 years. They were small, as delegations go. Most of the major species kept 15 to 30 representatives in permanent rotation. The humans kept 5. Elaine Norwood, the ambassador. A deputy named Colin Vares, who was young and quiet and took notes with a physical pen on actual paper, which no one else in the building did. A science advisor named Dr. Priya Anand, who had more credentials than anyone I had ever processed security clearance for and who dressed like she had just come from a laboratory and forgot to change. A logistics coordinator named Owen Garrett, who knew the name of every maintenance worker, janitor, and food service operator in the entire spire. And a communications officer named Sandra Bell, who had the ability to speak 14 council languages without a translator and who, when off duty, would sometimes bring food to share in the archives where I worked. They had been admitted to the council on probationary status 41 years ago. Provisional Tier 3. The lowest classification the council had. Their voting weight was listed as 0.003% of total deliberative power. In practical terms, this meant their votes were recorded but never actually changed the outcome of anything. Their motions were routinely tabled. Their proposals were treated as suggestions from a junior colleague who did not yet understand how things worked. When they spoke during open session, senior delegates from species like the Dalarak would sometimes talk over them, or check their personal devices, or simply leave the room. I have been watching politics for 41 years. I have learned to read the temperature of a room. In the last 2 years before the silence, I had watched something shift in the human delegation. Not dramatically. They did not become louder or angrier. They became quieter. They stopped requesting floor time for proposals they had submitted before. They stopped following up on tabled motions. Elaine Norwood, in particular, had developed a habit I noticed but could not name at the time. She would sit in her seat during long sessions, listening carefully, and sometimes she would write something in a small notebook and then close it and look at the ceiling for a moment, as if she had just confirmed something she already suspected. Her last recorded speech to the full council chamber was given 6 months before the silence. It was not remarkable for its length or its drama. It was 3 minutes long. She spoke about infrastructure redundancy, about the importance of not concentrating critical services in the hands of any single provider, about the value of acknowledging contributions before they become absences. She spoke quietly. She did not raise her voice. When she finished, the deputy chair moved on to the next item on the agenda without comment, and the session continued. I pulled that transcript on the evening of the third day, when the delegation suite was empty and the cup on Terminal 7G had finally gone cold. I read it twice. Then I opened the trade and logistics manifests I maintained as part of my archive duties, the ones no one ever asked to see unless something went wrong. I started looking for human names, human companies, human supply routes. What I found made me sit very still for a long time. I had been an archivist for 41 years. I was good at finding things. And I had just found something that I understood, with cold certainty, that the Grand Arbiter had not looked for yet. I drafted a memo. I labeled it urgent. I sent it to 7 people above me in the administrative hierarchy. Then I sat in my chair in the archives and waited, and the conclave spire hummed around me the way it always did, vast and confident and completely unaware that the morning it woke up to was already different from the morning it had gone to sleep in. The cup on Terminal 7G was cold now. Nobody had moved it. The first failure was quiet. That is how collapses always begin. Not with an explosion, but with a machine that does not turn on, a supply that does not arrive, a signal that does not come through. By the time anyone is alarmed, the chain has already been breaking for weeks. It was a medical facility on Marin Station 7, in the outer ring of the Marin Confederation. A standard bioscaffold printing array used to grow replacement tissue for patients who could not tolerate synthetic alternatives. The array required a stabilizing compound called Terranite 7 to function. Without it, the scaffolding process produced tissue that was structurally unstable. The tissue looked correct. It even tested correctly in the short term. But under physiological stress, it failed. In some cases this meant a slow deterioration. In a small number of cases, it meant something much worse. The facility had 90 days of Terranite 7 in reserve when the human delegation went silent. No one at the facility had thought to order more in advance, because the supply had always arrived on schedule. The human cooperative that produced Terranite 7 operated out of Kepler Station in the Outer Sol system. It had been producing this compound for 22 years without a single missed shipment. Reliable suppliers do not get the attention that unreliable ones do. That is the nature of reliability. It disappears into the background. It becomes invisible. It becomes something you stop thinking about, because thinking about it is unnecessary, and being unnecessary is the closest thing to not existing. The supply did not arrive on day 91. I was summoned to testify before the Council's Emergency Economic Subcommittee 12 days after that, when the Marin Confederation sent a formal distress notice and someone in the administrative chain finally picked up my memo from 3 months earlier and read it. I brought everything I had. I want to describe that room, because I think it matters. The subcommittee chamber was smaller than the main council floor, designed for working sessions rather than ceremony. The table was long and oval and made from a wood-like material that was not actually wood, because actual wood from any inhabited planet was considered too symbolically loaded for a neutral chamber. The delegates seated around it represented 9 species, all of them old enough to remember when humanity was still an interstellar rumor, a young species that had just learned to fold space and was tentatively reaching outward with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who has just realized how large the house they wandered into actually is. Consul Mavris of the Dalarak sat at the head of the working table. He was senior, formal, and deeply certain of his own competence in the way that long power tends to produce. He had the look of someone who had been surprised before and had decided, on some level, never to allow it to happen again. I stood at the presenter's position and I laid out my findings. Humanity had, over the course of 41 years of provisional Tier 3 membership, quietly become the supplier of 38% of all rare isotope medical compounds used in Council-affiliated space. They had done this not through any formal agreement or exclusive contract, but through a slow accumulation of small cooperative arrangements, each one unremarkable on its own, each one filling a gap that no one else had filled because it was not profitable enough or logistically convenient enough for larger species to bother with. The gaps were small. The humans filled them anyway. Beyond medical compounds, I had found something more significant. The Council maintained an ancient network of FTL relay buoys, communication nodes built on technology so old that most species no longer manufactured the components needed to repair them. They worked, when they worked, because someone was maintaining them. I had traced the maintenance contracts. 91% of active buoy maintenance in sectors 4 through 9 was handled by a single human engineering cooperative headquartered on a station that most Council members had never heard of. The cooperative had been operating under a rolling contract that automatically renewed every 3 years. It had last renewed 17 months ago. Consul Mavris interrupted me before I reached the third finding. "This cannot be accurate," he said. He did not say it with anger. He said it the way someone says something that contradicts a belief they have held for a long time, with a particular kind of flat denial that is not quite disbelief and not quite refusal. "We have been here for 8,000 years. How could a species admitted 40 years ago on provisional status become essential to our infrastructure?" I slid the data to his terminal. He looked at it. Then he looked up at me. "How long have you known about this?" he asked. "I began finding it 3 days after the delegation went silent," I said. "I filed a report within the week. It was my 7th filing. I have a record of the submission timestamps if you would like to review them." He did not ask to review them. I continued with my presentation. The third finding was the one that changed the temperature of the room most significantly. I had been pulling agricultural data as part of my search, because human agricultural biotechnology had appeared frequently in my cross-references. What I found there was not dramatic on its own. It was a subcontract, several layers deep in the procurement chain, for soil microbiome maintenance on agricultural colonies. The Dalarak hegemony's outer agricultural worlds used a soil management system that required periodic treatment with a biological agent. The agent was produced and delivered by a human biotech company that operated under a contract held by a middleman firm that held a contract with a distributor that held a contract with the hegemony's Colonial Agricultural Bureau. No one in the Colonial Agricultural Bureau's senior administration knew the human company existed. They knew the distributor. The distributor knew the middleman. The middleman knew the biotech company. The biotech company had stopped accepting new orders 63 days ago. Their last delivery had been made 31 days ago. The next delivery cycle was due in 49 days. Without treatment, the soil microbiome on the Dalarak outer colonies would begin to degrade. The degradation would be slow, then rapid. The first sign would be reduced yields. The second sign would be crop failures. The room was very quiet when I finished. Consul Mavris sat with his hands flat on the table. He had the look of a man doing arithmetic in his head and arriving at a number he did not want to accept. "What is your recommendation?" he asked. "We should attempt contact with the Sol Confederacy immediately," I said. "Not through a standard diplomatic channel. A direct, senior-level communication. Something that signals we are not treating this as a routine matter. We sent a standard inquiry 3 weeks ago," said a delegate from the Felhuri Compact. "It was not returned." "The message was received but not returned," I said. "There is a difference. A message that is not returned is a decision. We should treat it as a decision and respond accordingly, rather than waiting for the standard diplomatic timeline to expire." Mavris looked at me for a moment. "You are an archivist," he said. "Yes," I said. "You are recommending that we treat this as a crisis." I am recommending that we treat it as a situation that will become a crisis if we do not act now, I said. The difference between those two things is approximately 49 days. There was a long pause. We will send an enhanced inquiry, said Mavris. A formal one, with senior signatory status. I went back to my archive and pulled Ambassador Elaine Norwood's final speech again. I read the part where she talked about acknowledging contributions before they become absences. The formal enhanced inquiry was drafted that evening. It was sent through the standard FTL relay network, which routed messages through a series of buoys in sectors 4 through 9. 2 of those buoys had developed faults in the past month. There was no one scheduled to repair them. The inquiry arrived at Seoul. No reply came. 3 weeks later, I resigned from my archive position and accepted an appointment to the Council's Emergency Logistics Advisory Group. The filing rooms I had worked in for 41 years were given to 2 junior archivists who had been trained to record history. I was apparently now being asked to prevent it. I requested access to the full 10-year trade archive. I hired 14 analysts. I moved a second desk into my old filing room. I put a photograph of the council chamber on the wall where the calendar used to hang. I stared at that photograph every morning when I came in and every evening when I left, and I asked myself the same question: what else did we not notice? What else had the humans been doing quietly, for years, in the spaces between our attention? The answer kept getting larger. Every file I opened led to 3 more. Every subcontract pointed to a network. Every network traced back to Seoul. I found a water purification maintenance contract for the Pulhari refugee resettlement stations. Human company. 430,000 residents depending on systems maintained by people who were no longer answering communications. I found a cold chain logistics network for live organ transport across 6 outer sectors. Human operated. Irreplaceable in the current time frame. No species had the route infrastructure to substitute. I found a data backup service for the Council's own historical archive. The redundant off-site backup, the one that was supposed to survive if the primary archive was ever damaged. Human hosted. On a server cluster in the outer Seoul system. I stopped counting at 43 dependencies. Not because there were only 43. Because I had run out of column space in my spreadsheet and I needed to restructure the file. That evening, Sandra Bell's name came up in a cross-reference I was running on communication infrastructure. She had, in her years as the Human Communications Officer, quietly built a translation and routing service that 12 council member species used without knowing its origin. She had never mentioned it in any session. It appeared nowhere in any human delegation filing. It was simply there, doing its job, invisible because it had never failed. I sat for a long time after I found that one. I thought about Sandra Bell bringing food to share in the archives where I worked. I thought about Owen Garrett knowing the name of every maintenance worker in the building. I thought about Colin Varis with his paper notebook. I thought about Dr. Priya Anand with her 12-page credentials list and her laboratory clothes. I thought about Elaine Norwood looking at the ceiling after she wrote something in her notebook, confirming something she already suspected. They knew. They had known for a long time. They had watched the council look through them, talk over them, ignore their proposals, and table their motions, and they had gone on doing what they did anyway, quietly, without credit, without recognition, without a single session resolution acknowledging their contributions. And at some point, they had made a decision. Not an angry decision. A calm one. I found the record of that decision 2 weeks later, in a recovered communication from the Seoul Confederacy's Internal Policy Archive. It was not classified. It had not been hidden. It had simply never been requested, because no one had thought to look. It was the minutes from a Seoul Confederacy internal governance session held 8 months before the silence. The session had been called to review the human delegation's status and make a recommendation about the future of their council membership. The discussion had been thorough. Several voices in the room had argued for staying, for continuing to push for better standing, for trusting the process. They had made good arguments. They had been heard with respect. The final resolution was passed with a majority of 67%. It read, "The Seoul Confederacy has made its contributions to the Galactic community clear. It has made its concerns regarding procedural equity clear. It has made its requests for fair standing clear. Having done so repeatedly and without result, it will not do so again. The human delegation will conclude its current session cycle and will not return. Soul will develop independent relationships with willing partners on its own terms, in its own time. There was no anger in that language. No declaration of grievance. No list of complaints. Just a simple, quiet statement of conclusion, the kind of language that comes not from a moment of fury but from a long and careful process of arriving at the end of patience. I submitted my first full report to the council that same evening. 214 pages. I titled it simply, What We Took, and What We Lost. Consul Mavris called me at midnight to tell me I had overstepped. I told him the Dalarak outer colonies had 31 days of soil treatment remaining. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would review the report. I went back to my desk and opened the next file. I had not left Verith Prime in 20 years. I had not needed to. The galaxy comes to Verith Prime, or at least it used to. The Conclave Spire sits at the center of the most trafficked transit hub in the known systems, a structure so old that its original architects are a matter of genuine historical dispute. Species have come to this building to argue, to negotiate, to sign documents that change the course of civilizations. Everything I needed to know, I had always been able to find from my archive desk. That changed when I joined the Logistics Advisory Group. The council chamber was full of theories about what was happening out in the sectors. Reports were being filed, numbers were being cited, delegates were debating causes and timelines and responsibility. None of them had been there. I was beginning to understand that this mattered. I requested a field assignment. It took 2 weeks of bureaucratic resistance before it was approved, largely because the council's senior administrative structure was not accustomed to archivists going anywhere, and also because the transport network was beginning to show the first signs of strain. 3 of the major FTL relay buoys in Sectors 6 and 7 were now running on reduced capacity. Message lag was increasing. Ships were taking longer routes to avoid navigation uncertainty in areas where the hazard mapping data had not been updated. I traveled on a council courier vessel with a crew of 4. The first stop was a way station in Sector 5 called Outpost Henna, a mid-route service platform that handled refueling, minor repairs, and cargo transfer for about 40 ships per standard day. When we docked, I understood immediately that something was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not visibly collapsed, but wrong in the way that a well-kept building feels wrong when you realize no one has lived in it for months. Everything was in order. The systems were running. The lights were on. The refueling stations were operational. But the crew running Outpost Henna was 4 people short of its standard complement, and the 4 missing people had all been human contract workers whose rotations had ended and who had not been replaced. The station manager, a Felhuri woman named Dasa, had been running the operation since then with what she had. "We are managing," she told me, in the careful way that people describe situations that are not yet crises but are approaching them. "What did they handle?" I asked. She showed me. The humans who had rotated through Outpost Henna had run the technical maintenance logs, the component inventory system, and the deep system diagnostic checks that were performed on vessels passing through. These were not glamorous jobs. They were detailed, patient, methodical jobs that required someone willing to spend hours looking at data for problems that might not materialize for weeks. "Can we find people to replace them?" I asked. "We can find people," Dasa said. "The training takes 6 months for the diagnostics work. 2 months for the inventory system. We have had 2 applicants for the positions. 1 left after the first week. The other is still here." She paused. "She is doing her best." I spent a day at Outpost Henna going through the maintenance logs. The last entries made by the human workers were organized with a precision that I recognized immediately as characteristic. Not only was the work done, it was documented in a way that would allow someone unfamiliar with the systems to understand what had been done and why. They had written handover notes. Detailed ones. Explaining their methods, flagging potential future issues, noting which components were aging and in which sequence they were likely to need attention. They had prepared for their own absence. They had done everything they could to make the transition manageable for whoever came after them. Standing in that service bay, reading those notes, I felt something that I do not have a clean word for in my language. It was not admiration exactly, though there was admiration in it. It was closer to the feeling of recognizing, too late, a quality you had failed to value while it was present. I visited 6 more outposts. The story was the same at all of them, with variations only in the degree of impact. At one station, the human workers had managed the water recycling system, and the backup protocols they had left were the only reason the station was still fully operational 3 months later. At another, the humans had run a small but apparently crucial shuttle coordination service that allowed cargo from 3 different species vessels to transfer efficiently. Without the coordination, transfer times had tripled. Without efficient transfers, ships were waiting longer. Ships waiting longer meant supply chains running slower. On the 4th day, I met a Felhuri freighter captain named Oren, who had spent 15 years running cargo routes through the outer sectors. We sat in a small station cafeteria and I asked him about the humans he had worked alongside. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. The thing about them, he said, is that they never seem to need the acknowledgement. Most species, when they do something significant, they want you to know. They want it in the record. They want the credit. Not because they are greedy, just because recognition is part of how communities function. You do a thing, the community notes the thing becomes part of your standing. The humans work differently. They would solve a problem and move on. They would fix something that had been broken for years and then just go back to their regular duties as if it was nothing. He picked up his cup, considered it, and set it back down. We thought that meant the problem was small, he said. We thought, if this was important, they would have made more of it. We judged the significance of their work by how much noise they made about it. They made no noise. So we assumed it was small. He looked at the table. We were very wrong about what their silence meant. I returned to Verith Prime 2 weeks after I had left. I went directly to the Grand Arbiter's office. Thesavon was still in his position, though there was a quiet movement among junior council members to challenge him on procedural grounds. He received me with the particular weariness of someone who has been hearing bad news for months and has chosen, as a strategy, to dispute the severity of each piece rather than synthesize them into a whole. You've been in the field, he said. Yes. And your conclusion? My conclusion is that we are not dealing with a disruption, I said. We are dealing with a structural absence. There is a difference. A disruption can be managed by working harder and moving faster. A structural absence requires a different response. It requires us to acknowledge what was there, understand why it is now gone, and address the underlying conditions before we can have any meaningful conversation about restoration. Thesavon leaned back in his chair. You are saying we need to apologize to them, he said. I am saying we need to understand what we are apologizing for before we attempt it, I said. An apology that does not understand the injury is not an apology. It is a request for someone to stop being inconvenient. He did not like that. I had not expected him to. We have authorized a formal diplomatic mission to Seoul, he said. I had heard about this. The mission Thesavon had authorized was not a single envoy vessel carrying a respectful message. It was a fleet. 14 Dalarak cruisers, carrying a full diplomatic staff and a security complement. I asked why 14 cruisers were necessary. Thesavon said the mission needed to convey the appropriate weight and seriousness. I thought about Elaine Norwood's last speech. I thought about the way the council had responded to it, by moving immediately to the next agenda item. I asked Thesavon to reconsider the composition of the mission. I asked him to send a single vessel. A small one. Something that conveyed humility rather than presence. He told me that humility was not the posture of the council. I left his office and went back to my desk and wrote the second report. The fleet was authorized and dispatched the following week. I stayed at my desk and continued pulling files. There were still things in the archive that no one had looked at yet. I had a feeling that the most important ones were the ones that had been sitting there the longest, the quiet steady work that had been there so long it had simply become part of the background, assumed, unexamined, as invisible as air. I kept looking. Because if Thesavon's fleet came back from Seoul empty-handed, and I believed it would, we would need something more than a fleet the next time. We would need the truth about what we had done, written down clearly enough that no one could avoid seeing it. I worked through the night. I was still at my desk when the fleet left the station. The fleet returned in 11 days. I was not surprised by how quickly it came back. I was not surprised by what it brought with it, which was no agreement, no meeting, and no human representative on board. What surprised me, and I will be honest that it surprised me, was what the fleet had found when it arrived at Seoul. I learned the details from the mission report, which I was given access to as part of my advisory role. I read it twice, slowly. The fleet had entered the Seoul system without prior authorization, which was the first mistake, and the one that shaped everything that followed. They had been met at the boundary of the system by an automated signal from something called the Seoul Boundary Authority, a body that had not existed in any council record before that moment. The signal was calm, professional, and delivered in 11 council languages. It identified the zone as being under independent jurisdiction, acknowledged the fleet's presence, and requested that they state their purpose before proceeding. The fleet admiral, a Galactic officer named Renval who was competent in the military sense and deeply unequipped for the cultural situation he was walking into, decided that the signal was a formality. He proceeded. What he found inside the system was the second surprise. Humanity had been busy. The Seoul system that the Council's records described, based on surveys and intelligence gathered in the years when the human delegation was still present, was a populated but still developing system. A single inhabited world, one permanent off-world colony, several research stations, a modest shipbuilding infrastructure. What Renval found was different. The asteroid belt had become a dense manufacturing corridor. Ships moved through it in coordinated patterns that suggested not a dozen vessels but hundreds, operating in a logistics grid that Renval's own navigators described, in their report, as more efficient than anything they had seen in Council-affiliated space. The energy collection infrastructure around the inner planets had been expanded to a scale that Renval's engineers estimated as equivalent to a civilization 2 full development tiers above what humanity's council records listed. They had not been hiding. They had simply been working, at the speed that apparently comes from not spending 41 years attending meetings where nothing you say is taken seriously. Renval hailed the nearest populated station and was connected, after a brief wait, to a human Port Authority officer named Lori, who was friendly, efficient, and entirely unmoved by the presence of 14 Galactic cruisers in her jurisdiction. She informed Admiral Renval that the Seoul Confederacy was not currently accepting unscheduled diplomatic missions. She offered to place the mission on the scheduling queue for a formal appointment. She suggested, helpfully, that future visits would go more smoothly if the fleet filed an entry request before crossing the jurisdictional boundary rather than after. Renval, to his credit, did not escalate the encounter. He filed a temporary visit registration, accepted a transit pass for his fleet, and spent 2 days in a designated holding orbit before returning home. In his official report, in a section labeled Personal Observations, which is the section of mission reports where officers write what they actually think rather than what they are supposed to say, Renval wrote, "This species has not been waiting for us. I am not certain they have been thinking about us at all. Whatever we believed about our relative positions in this matter, we were operating from incorrect assumptions." I read that section 4 times. I want to be clear about what the Council did with this information, because it is the part of the record I most want to preserve accurately. The official response was drafted by Thesavon's office and characterized the Seoul visit as a preliminary reconnaissance that had confirmed the need for further diplomatic engagement. It did not mention the manufacturing infrastructure. It did not mention the Seoul Boundary Authority. It did not mention the scheduling queue. It framed the return of the fleet as a natural pause before a second, more structured approach. I submitted a formal objection to this characterization through the advisory group. I wrote, in careful language, that the fleet's experience at Seoul should be understood as a significant data point about the current balance of circumstances and that any future approach should be designed with full awareness of that balance. My objection was received, acknowledged, and filed. 2 days after I submitted it, I discovered that someone had requested access to my full personal file archive, including all 14 months of research, all 43 dependency assessments, and the 2 major reports I had submitted. The access had been flagged as administrative review. I did not know who had requested it. The following morning, I found out. 6 junior council members had read the second report. All 6 had been quietly circulating it among their colleagues for 3 weeks. On the morning after my file was accessed, all 6 submitted formal motions of no confidence in the Grand Arbiter's handling of the Seoul situation. Under Council procedural rules, 6 simultaneous motions of this kind triggered a mandatory full-session review. Thesavon's office attempted to table the review on scheduling grounds. The Marin Confederation, without consulting anyone or requesting permission, opened independent trade talks with the Seoul Confederacy the same afternoon. It was the first time in 290 years that a council member had broken protocol to conduct independent external diplomacy. It broke something open that had been sealed shut for a very long time. Over the next 3 weeks, I stopped counting the number of people who requested copies of my reports. I had sent them through official channels. Someone, and I have never confirmed who, had distributed them through unofficial ones as well. My terminal received 112 messages in a single day, from council staff, from planetary administrations, from logistics coordinators and station managers and medical directors and agricultural officers who had spent months watching their operations strain under absences they could not explain and were now reading, in plain language, exactly what had happened and why. A delegate from the VETH assembly came to my office. She sat across the desk from me and put a printed copy of my second report on the surface between us and said, "You have been sitting on this material for over a year. Why did no one listen to you?" "They were listening," I said. "They simply did not believe the conclusion." She looked at the report. "Why not?" I thought for a moment before I answered. I wanted to be accurate. Because the conclusion required them to accept that something they had not paid attention to had become critical, I said. And accepting that means accepting that their attention was wrong. For 8,000 years, the Council has operated on the assumption that the most important things are the things that make the most noise. Humanity made very little noise. Therefore, by the Council's operational assumption, humanity was not important. The conclusion I reached was not just about logistics. It was about the assumption itself. That is a much harder thing to hear. She picked up the report and left. 2 days later, Thesavon submitted his resignation. He did not frame it as a response to the no-confidence motions. He framed it as a decision to allow new leadership to address a new kind of challenge. The language was careful and the meaning was clear. The Council was without a grand arbiter for 19 days. In those 19 days, 3 more sector communication buoys failed. The cold chain organ transport network lost 2 routes permanently because the infrastructure degraded past recoverable thresholds. The Dalarak outer colonies reported their first reduced harvest. The new grand arbiter was a Valari diplomat named Sara, one of my own people. She had spent 30 years working outer sector mediation. She had a reputation for listening before speaking, which was, I had come to believe, the rarest skill in the building. Her first act was to summon me to her office. "I have read everything you have written," she said. "I am aware," I said. "I want to send an envoy to Seoul," she said. "1 vessel. No fleet. I want someone who deals in truth rather than politics." She looked at me. "I want you to go." I had not been trained as a diplomat. I said this. "I know," she said. "I think that is the point." I went home that night and stood in my apartment for a long time, looking at nothing. I thought about Elaine Norwood's cup, still sitting on Terminal 7G in the council chamber, cold now for well over a year. I had walked past it dozens of times. No one had moved it. I had come to think of it as a kind of marker. Not of absence, exactly. More of a question that the building was still asking itself and had not yet been able to answer. The next morning, before I went to the council to begin preparing for the mission, I stopped at Terminal 7G. I stood there for a moment. Then I picked up the cup and carried it to the recycler at the end of the corridor. It felt like the right thing to do before going to ask for forgiveness. We were granted entry on the 3rd day. That detail matters. I want you to understand what it means to arrive at the boundary of another civilization's home system, submit a request for entry, and then wait. Not wait while they deliberate frantically about what to do with you. Simply wait while they review the request and process it on their own schedule, in their own time, as they would for any other applicant. We were not special. We were not threatening. We were not urgent. We were a single vessel from an organization that had, for 14 months, slowly been discovering how many things it did not know, and we had come to a door and knocked politely, and the door had opened when the people inside were ready to open it. I had traveled with a small team. A senior translator named Davi, who had worked outer sector communications for 20 years and had the kind of quiet steadiness that long-distance work tends to build. A logistics officer named Claire, whose function was essentially to carry the documentation that proved we understood what we were asking for. And a medical attaché named Owen, not the same Owen who had worked in the human delegation but a coincidence of name that I found quietly meaningful, who was present because the first formal request we were delivering concerned the medical compound situation and we needed someone who could discuss the technical specifics credibly. The Seoul Port Authority guided us to a docking platform on a station I did not have a record for. It was not on any of our charts. It had been built in the 14 months since the delegation left, or possibly before that, a structure that told me, even before I left the ship, that the picture the council had held of the Seoul system had been incomplete for a long time. A human official met us at the docking collar. He gave his name as Philip, introduced himself as a liaison with the Seoul Confederacy External Affairs Office, and shook hands with each of us in the human manner, which I had seen Elaine Norwood do for 11 years and which I now found unexpectedly affecting. Philip was neither warm nor cold. He was professional in the way of someone who is doing a job carefully and without theatrics. He escorted us to a transit shuttle and we moved through the station in silence, looking out the window at a civilization that had apparently decided, in the absence of anyone's permission or blessing, to build itself on its own terms. We were taken to a meeting facility on the 3rd level of the station. It was a plain room. A table, chairs, a window looking out onto an interior atrium where several humans sat eating lunch at small tables below. No ceremony. No decorative flags or species banners. No formal seating arrangement that placed one party at an advantage. Just a table and chairs and a window. I had been in the council chamber for 41 years. I had attended formal diplomatic sessions in venues designed to impress, to overawe, to establish hierarchy through architecture. This room did none of those things. It was simply functional, and I found, sitting down in it, that functional was exactly right. We waited for 12 minutes. Then the door opened and Elaine Norwood walked in. She was the same. That was my first thought. 11 years, and she was the same. The same watchful patience, the same economy of movement, the same quality of attention that made you feel, when she looked at you, that she was genuinely interested in what you were doing there. She was dressed simply. She carried no documents, no tablet, no visible notes. She sat across the table from me and folded her hands and looked at me without speaking. I had prepared a statement. A careful opening, acknowledgement of the circumstances, an expression of the council's understanding that the situation had developed in ways that required a new kind of conversation. I had written and rewritten it for 2 weeks on the transit to Seoul. I had rehearsed it with Davi until the language felt natural and the pacing felt right. I did not give the statement. Looking at Elaine Norwood across that plain table, I understood that a prepared statement was the wrong instrument for this moment. A prepared statement is a performance. It is language shaped to produce a desired response. And sitting across from the woman who had spent 11 years watching the council look through her and speak over her and table her motions, I understood with complete clarity that performing was the last thing I should be doing. I said, "I owe you an honest accounting." She waited. "We did not understand what you were doing," I said. "Not because it was hidden, but because we were not looking. You were working in the spaces between our attention, in the gaps that no one else filled, in the functions that were necessary and unglamorous and therefore invisible to a body that measured significance by ceremony. You did this for 41 years. You did it without credit, without recognition, without a single formal acknowledgement that any of it mattered. And when you asked, through proper channels, in proper language, with proper documentation, for standing that reflected the reality of your contribution, we tabled the motion and moved to the next item on the agenda." I paused. I wanted to say the next part correctly. "You did not leave in anger," I said. "I read the resolution. You left because you had concluded that the conversation was not going to change, and you had decided to stop having it on terms that did not serve you. That was not impulsive. That was not a tantrum. It was a reasoned decision made by a civilization that had run out of patience with an institution that was not capable of recognizing its own errors." Elaine Norwood looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "How many people on the council read your reports?" "Eventually, most of them," I said. "And before that?" "Before that, very few." "What changed?" "The Marin Confederation ran out of Terranite 7, I said. She nodded slowly. It was not a surprised nod. It was the nod of someone whose expectations had been confirmed. We are not interested in returning to the council as it was, she said. We are not interested in Tier 3 status. We are not interested in motions that will be tabled. We are not interested in voting weight that is ceremonial rather than functional. She reached into the folder she had carried in and placed a document on the table. This is what we are interested in. I picked it up. It was 31 pages. I am an archivist. I read quickly. I read the entire document in the room, while Elaine Norwood and Philip and my own team sat in silence and waited. The document was a proposed framework for what it called a co-governance compact, a relationship between the Seoul Confederacy and the Council that did not place Seoul within the Council's hierarchy but alongside it. Equal standing on infrastructure decisions. Full voting weight on any matter that touched Seoul-administered systems or Seoul-affiliated services. A formal joint commission to audit and document shared dependencies, so that what had happened over the past 14 months could not happen again through ignorance. A sunset clause on the old provisional Tier 3 designation, to be replaced by a new classification, independent peer civilization. The document also contained, at the back, an appendix. The appendix was a complete record of every motion the human delegation had submitted to the Council over 41 years, with the date of submission and the outcome. Every single one that had been tabled was listed. Every single one that had been dismissed without discussion was listed. Every single one that had been passed with no formal acknowledgement of its origin was listed. It was not an accusation. It was a record. It was the kind of document an archivist produces, not to argue but to prevent future arguments from being based on selective memory. I looked up from the appendix. Who compiled this? I asked. Colin Varies, she said. He has been an archivist since we came home. He kept everything. I thought about Colin Varies with his physical pen and his paper notebook. I thought about how I had always assumed he was taking personal notes, reminders for himself. I had never thought to ask what he was actually writing down. I set the document on the table and looked at Elaine Norwood. I do not have the authority to sign this, I said. I need to bring it to the Council and to the new Grand Arbiter. That process will take time. We know, she said. We are not in a hurry. The medical compound situation is urgent, I said. And the relay buoy network, and the cold chain logistics. These cannot wait for a full ratification process. I know, she said. We have been watching the degradation. We have our own assessments. She nodded to Philip, who produced a second document. This is a temporary operational agreement. It covers emergency resumption of essential services while the main compact is under review. It has no political conditions attached. It is simply what needs to happen to keep people from being harmed while the formal process proceeds. I looked at the operational agreement. It was 4 pages. It was clear and practical and entirely devoid of the kind of language that generates arguments. Why no political conditions? I asked. Elaine Norwood looked at me with an expression I had seen on her face before, years ago, across the council chamber floor, in moments when the answer to a question was so obvious that the act of asking it was itself revealing. Because people should not be harmed while institutions argue about standing, she said. That was always true. We always believed it. The fact that the Council did not extend us the same consideration does not mean we should now make people wait while we settle a score. I signed the operational agreement on behalf of the Council's emergency authority. I was not certain I had the mandate to do this. I did it anyway and wrote a full account of my reasoning in my advisory log for the record. Elaine Norwood signed on behalf of the Seoul Confederacy. Philip took the signed copies and left the room. We sat for a moment in silence. Outside the window, people were eating lunch in the atrium below. A human child ran between the tables and was collected, gently, by an adult who carried the child to a seat. Ordinary life, in an ordinary station, in a system that had spent 14 months building itself into something no one in the council chamber had imagined possible. There is something I need to ask you, I said. She waited. You knew, I said. You knew, before you left, what the effect would be. You knew what the council would discover when the services stopped. You knew what the files would show, if anyone looked. You prepared for the absence. The handover notes, the documentation, the maintenance logs, all of it was done with the knowledge that someone would eventually need to understand what had been there. She did not deny it. Then you could have made it dramatic, I said. You could have released the dependency assessments yourselves before you left. You could have made the council aware of what it was losing. You could have used it as leverage. Yes, she said. Why didn't you? She was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice was the same as it had always been across the council chamber floor, calm, precise, without performance. Because the point was not to frighten you into valuing us, she said. The point was for you to understand, on your own, what you had overlooked. Fear produces compliance. Understanding produces change. We wanted change. And change only happens when an institution reaches a conclusion itself, rather than being pushed into it. She looked at me. You reached the conclusion yourself. Your reports were the council reaching a conclusion. Not because we forced it, but because someone in your building was honest enough to look and write down what they saw. I thought about my memo from the first week, the one I had sent to 7 people above me in the hierarchy that no one had read. It took a long time, I said. It did, she said. People were harmed in the meantime. She looked at the table. Yes, she said. That is the part we carry. We tried to minimize it. The handover notes, the phased departure, the emergency services appendix, all of that was to limit the harm. But we knew there would be some. We made a decision that the long-term cost of remaining in a system that would never change was greater than the short-term cost of leaving it. She looked up at me. I am not certain we were right. I think we were right. But I am not certain. That honesty landed differently than anything else she had said. It did not resolve the question. It did not close anything. It simply acknowledged that the question was real, and that the people who made the decision had sat with it. We talked for another 2 hours. Not about the compact or the agreement, but about the specifics of the transition. What could be resumed quickly? What would take longer? Where the greatest points of strain were. Elaine Norwood knew the logistics of the council's infrastructure better than most of the people who had been running it for the past year, because she had spent 11 years watching it from seat 7G and paying attention when everyone around her was not. When we finished, she stood and extended her hand. I shook it. I will bring the compact to Grand Arbiter Sarah, I said. I believe she will receive it seriously. We know she will, Elaine Norwood said. We have been following her appointment closely. Of course they had. Philip escorted us back to the docking collar. As we walked through the station corridors, I watched the humans moving around us, working, talking, carrying things, directing cargo loaders, running diagnostics on wall panels, eating at a small food counter near the transit hub. They were busy. They had the quality of people who had somewhere to be and knew why they were going there. I thought about what Oren the freighter captain had told me, that the humans had worked without needing acknowledgement, that they made no noise, that the council had mistaken silence for smallness. I thought about what it means to work without needing to be seen. I thought about the 41 years of quiet presence, the maintained buoys and the filled gaps and the tabled motions and the cold cup of synthecaf, and the notebook that turned out to be the most complete record of the council's failures that anyone had ever compiled. We returned to our vessel. I sat in the small forward cabin while Davi filed the departure request and Claire secured the signed documents and Owen organized his medical notes. I opened my own notebook, a paper one. I had started keeping one 2 months into the crisis, partly because it felt right and partly because I had spent enough time reading Colin Varis's records to understand the value of writing things down in a form that cannot be remotely accessed or administratively reviewed. I wrote the date. I wrote the name of the station and the room number. I wrote Elaine Norwood's name, and Philip's, and the title of the compact, and the number of pages in the operational agreement. Then I sat for a while and thought about what I actually wanted to record, the thing that would matter to read later, when this moment had become history and the details of it risked being smoothed into something cleaner and more convenient than it actually was. I wrote, we were given something extraordinary and we called it ordinary because we did not build it ourselves. I looked at that for a moment. Then I wrote, this is the account of how the Galactic Council learned the difference between the two, and what it cost to be taught. The vessel cleared the docking collar. Through the forward window, I watched the Sol system open around us. Lights moved in the distance, hundreds of ships in their quiet coordinated patterns, the visible proof of what a civilization can build when it stops waiting for permission. I closed the notebook. I had a lot of work still to do. The compact needed to be presented, reviewed, argued over, and eventually ratified. The relay buoys needed repair crews and new maintenance contracts. The medical supply chains needed to be rebuilt with redundancy this time, with acknowledgement this time, with the kind of structural awareness that prevents the ignorance that precedes collapse. All of that was ahead of me. But I had been an archivist for 41 years. I knew that the moment of understanding, the moment when a civilization stops seeing a thing as background and starts seeing it as foundation, that moment is the hinge on which everything else turns. We had reached the hinge. What we built on the other side of it was still to be decided. But we were finally asking the right questions, and we were asking them honestly, and the door we had knocked on had opened, and the people on the other side of it had handed us, along with a fair and practical agreement, the most important thing, a way to begin. We flew home through a galaxy that was the same as it had always been and completely changed, and I wrote down everything I could remember, because that is what archivists do, and because some histories deserve to be told exactly as they happened, without comfort, without gloss, and without the pretense that we knew what we were doing before the silence taught us otherwise.